The Parley is a debate event that champions open-mindedness, kindness and respectful dialogue when exploring contradictory ideas. Museum of Sticks and Stones would like to acknowledge and extend our deep respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. This episode is recorded in Meanjin, the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. We acknowledge their connection to land, sea and community and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Will, the Museum of Sticks and Stones, it sounds like almost a fantasy place. It's a wonderful use of an old proverb. What is it?
Fantasy place, I guess is an interesting way to frame it. I hope so. Maybe a bit of a nightmare and a fantasy at the same time is kind of the idea. So the Museum of Sticks and Stones is the flagship initiative from our nonprofit, which has spent over a decade working in the space of mental health. And we, over the last couple of years, decided to look into the problem of hate and how hate impacts people's health and well-being. And the Museum of Sticks and Stones is the result of that work. So it's a call to action to remember and understand the fact that hate is human. It exists in all of us, and it is just part of how we're wired. We can't you can't expunge that from the human existence. It's there for a reason. But where it goes wrong is when we don't actually acknowledge that. And then it emerges in different ways: online bullying, in-person bullying, hatred, racism, war, all these things that emerge from hate. And our mission with the Museum of Sticks and Stones is to create a space where it's okay to look at that part of us and understand it, and then find the resources of how do you heal from it, how do you handle it when you're receiving hate, but also what do you do when you realize that you yourself are participating in hate and creating hate. And our method of doing that is to do a bunch of research, but also create really exciting and engaging things for the public. Make it something that everybody can come to the table with and leave that table more knowledgeable about what it is to be human.
Can you talk a little bit more about this universalism of hate? Because some people probably think they're the good guys, others are the bad guys, and have a more caricatured view of hate. But it sounds like one of your messages is that hate is everywhere. Yeah. Do you have research behind that or a concept behind it? Tell me more about this idea of hate being everywhere.
Universalism of hate is a wonderful phrase. Right. So we've done a bunch of research in partnership with a few organizations, one of them Ipsos, who looked into how does hate emerge online. And I will say, we went into this project, we had one hypothesis, which was that people don't want to create hate. They don't want to harm others online. And if we could show you how the things that you say and do online genuinely create harm in others as a result, you would stop being so hateful. The research that we did actually showed us that wasn't necessarily the case. And in fact, that people are less swayed by the knowledge that what they're doing is harming others than they are knowing that what they're doing is perceived by others to be negative or harmful or a troll. So that was one interesting realization. And why is that the case then, that we're less swayed by knowing that we've actually harmed somebody else? The other interesting component that we realized through the research is that hate is everywhere online. So it's not, I think we tend to think of hate online as being in the comment section on Instagram or YouTube or wherever it might be. Our research actually found it's everywhere. So it is there. It's also in family chats, which I may be guilty of myself. It's also in fan forums. So you love the same thing. Like if you're a Swiftie or you're a Star Wars nerd, you also hate your similar fans, which seems bizarre. It's in community forums. It's in university forums. It's literally everywhere that people interact online. And so it is universal. The other, I think, interesting thing to think about hate is it is a function for a purpose. So as we evolved, and there's a really interesting bit of research around racism and hate. And I want to make a really clear distinction when we talk about hate. We're not talking about racism. Racism is a construct that was developed off the back of hate. Hate is a natural human expression. Whereas when we evolved back and we operated in small tribal groups, everybody looked the same. So racism wasn't really a thing you could actually do because you're all the same people. But identifying that whether you were part of the same social group was important, because resources were scarce, we didn't know each other, and so if you're coming down the road and I don't know who you are, I'm going to naturally assume you might be a threat, and so it's easier to hate you. That is why hate exists, to identify other threats. The problem I feel that we have now is that we're not just existing in really complex societies in person, but we're also existing in a separate world online where we are exposed to lots of different viewpoints, identities that can sometimes clash with our own, or worldviews that we don't understand. And the natural human reaction to that is to default to, that could be a threat, I'm going to hate that person. And that has created, I think, a runaway effect of, it's so much easier to hate somebody for their identity, for their viewpoint, for their worldview, than it is to look at what makes us similar. And a lot harder to do that when you're online and you can't sit face to face with somebody and think about what makes us similar is the fact that we're human, regardless of what we feel.
It's almost tapping into that in-group, out-group mentality that's straight from biology. Like, to take your caveman example from the earliest days, even though we look the same, some of us were Broncos supporters, some of us were Sharks fans, and so we'll find something to disagree about. So we're primed to do this.
And sports is a really great analogy, and I kind of suspect sports is an outlet for it. Like, it gives us something safe to be part of a group for, whether you're Broncos or Sharks or whatever. You know, Dolphins up the fins, I think is the call. But it's sports, so it's not like we're going to war with each other. We're not actually killing each other, but we get to feel like my group is winning. There's a concept called social dominance theory, which is that in any complex enough society, everybody eventually defaults to wanting your group to be the most socially dominant. So you want to be further up that hierarchy as possible. And it's never actually really a conscious thing, but you can see throughout history where it has taken to great effect with really disastrous results. But it's in every society. And so it is just something natural that happens in humans that we need to be more aware of. And if we can channel that into something like sports, I think it's actually a really great result.
Right, okay.
Rather than, creating a genocide.
I wonder, though, is this getting worse because of a few different pressures? One, we've got an ageing population, so we're all scampering for resources much more than maybe in the golden age of the 60s and 70s. Right. We've got more diversity, so there's more outward differences between people. There's maybe a range of factors which is encouraging people to compete more. Maybe we're more polarised politically than we were in the past. We don't believe in God anymore to unite us. There's all these different splittist factors in society. So do you think hate is peaking or getting stronger for a few different reasons, which is why the work you do is important?
That's a really good question, and there's a lot in there. So if I go on a rabbit hole, just pull me back in. Is hate getting worse and more prevalent? I would say yes, from what I've seen and what I've read. That said, I think it just repeats itself. So after COVID-19 erupted, and having originated in China, we did see a rise in anti-Chinese but also anti-Asian sentiment. And that seems shocking and horrible that people were being assaulted for simply being Asian. There was a lot of phrases thrown around about COVID-19, like Kung Flu, that were really, it was coded way to be racist. And you would say, well, that's terrible and shocking, but it's not new. So that actually happened in the 1930s, I believe it was, after a similar pandemic, particularly here in Australia, there was a rise in anti-Asian sentiment. And here in Brisbane, where we're today, Chinatown was the subject of white Australians going into businesses and shops, breaking windows, burning down houses, pulling people into the street and beating them up for being Asian. And the police at the time were quoted in the newspapers saying they didn't intervene because they were good people rioting. And I don't think that I think hate is increasing. I think the outlets or the ways it's expressed are the same old tropes. We use race as a factor. We use religion as a factor. We can use some things like, now I think it's if even things like, did you like Return of the Jedi? Or The Last Jedi, rather? And if you do, you're too woke. We find excuses to hate each other. It is an interesting point, too, about an aging population, and we have the resources are changing. I would actually argue we have more abundance now, but how it's distributed is different. If you go back to the 1950s, there was a lot of hate and there was a lot of segregation, and there was much more prevalent in-your-face racism and systemic racism. We talk about it a lot more now. Systemic racism still exists, but I also think that we've found different ways to express that without having to use established norms. And I think that there are groups that hate is a net benefit to you if you can perpetuate it. And I think that's one really difficult thing that we have to figure out is if hate is a function that does allow certain groups to have benefits, how do you help them to understand that what they're doing comes at the cost of damaging us all, which is a really hard conversation.
Yeah, to ask people to give up something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned Australia, the Chinese rights here, which there are markers of in the city as well, 160-year remembrances, I think, of them. Is there something unique about Australia when it comes to hate? Do we just import the American system, or do we have our own kinds of hate? And tell us more about that.
I don't know. My gut on it, though, is that I think there are certain cues that we take from American culture. I am very cautious to say that America is the cultural touchstone for the whole world. I think we have our own culture here in Australia, but we have similar problems, as does the UK or other countries. But then we also, you see similar things erupting in every culture in the world, in the Americas, in China. Like it's not. Hate is not, and defining people based on our concept of identity and then hating them as a result is on a uniquely modern Western phenomenon. If you even go back to Middle Ages in Britain, there was a particular group of people that were only allowed to enter churches via a special entryway. They were not allowed to eat with others from within towns and villages. And there was a lot of superstitions about what they were and whether they were, evil and magical and all these things. And historians have been unable to figure out what actually made them different. And it seems like all it was is that maybe they had a bit of lineage from Vikings. And so there was some residual hatred towards them. But if you and I were to go back in time and look at those two people, we couldn't tell the difference. Similarly, similar things have happened in Japan and in Africa. Like, this is not... It's human. Like we do like to put people in boxes and then that use it as a reason to hate each other. I think all what's happened is that has been supercharged by wealth inequality. And so the resources that you're talking about at a macro scale, we actually have more. But in how they're distributed means that we are all trying to get that dominance in order to be more secure and more stable. But then we also have an online world where we are forced to interact with different viewpoints that we find difficult. And then I think that carries across into the real world, where we're so primed to fight, we don't know how to switch off that aggression when we come face to face with each other.
Let's talk about two buzzwords that seem to inspire a lot of aggression in this online world: wokeness and cancel culture. Starting with wokeness, is it real? What is it? How significant is it?
Is wokeness real?
Yeah, was it just an attack by the right on the left? Is it one of those pejoratives, or is there some real substance to it?
As somebody who has been labelled very woke, I have to assume it's real. I think it's one of those things. I think the really complex thing about this topic and the work that we're doing is it is so layered. In that wokeness as a concept was originally a call to be aware to systemic racism and what you can do about it, whereas it's now been co-opted to be a pejorative about somebody who is overly sensitive. So is wokeness real? It depends upon your definition of what wokeness is. But I would say from the way that I view wokeness as being aware to injustices around you, it should be. Whether or not it is being used in the best possible way, I think is another question. And I think it's actually one of my learnings over the past couple of years of doing this work, which is I create hate. I receive hate. We all create and receive hate. And it's really easy when you believe passionately about equality or social justice or just not being a dick to other people.
Yeah.
That if you do see that online, you want to have a go and say, stop being a dick, and you're being harmful and you're a troll, etc. And I think the way I used to react to seeing that was I would create hate as a result. I would attack that person when they, from their viewpoint, were trying to stand up for what they believed in. And over the years of doing this work, I think I've become better at realizing that even though I can see somebody saying or doing something that I find is offensive, and it's heartbreaking in many ways, and I think it's just wrong and unfair, the stronger that I react with aggression and hatred towards that person doesn't actually change their mind. It just begets more hatred because they'll just dig further into their position. They've been attacked and being called wrong. They want to prove themselves right, so they'll fight back, and it just never ends. And I think that the one of the biggest challenges in trying to reduce hate online, as we are with this project, is hate is an arms race. It always comes down to who can punch the strongest and scream the loudest.
People have tried to say this same message before. I think there was Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, who talks about the dividing line between good and evil is right down the middle of you. So we're all good and evil. I'm just wondering, you've brought this up a couple of times now. We have to acknowledge that we're all capable of hate. We all contribute to hate. What do we do about that within ourselves? We don't go to confession anymore, a lot of us. Do we be mindful? What's the way to tackle the hate within us?
That's a really good question. There's have you heard that parable of there's two wolves inside of you? Yeah.
Yeah, tell us.
Yeah. Well, so the parable is, and for those that know the origin of this, I will get to it. But this is this old proverb where there's two wolves inside of you. There's a dark one and a light one, and the dark one is about anger and hatred and aggression. The light one is about goodness and generosity and all those things. And the proverb goes that there's old man's telling the younger man, which wolf do you think wins? And the answer is the one you feed. So the one that you give more resources to, if it's the negative one will win. The irony of that statement or that proverb is it's a lesson in doing good and being as morally just as possible. And it was originally attributed to Native American culture by a non-Native American pastor who, when he first came out with that proverb, the Inuit, who he said originally it was from, I believe, said, "Hey, don't put words in our mouth." Yeah. Like that, we didn't say that. Don't say that. So then he went, "Oh, it was Native American." And at the time, you can kind of do whatever you want in terms of that culture. So it just became set in stone. And we repeat that phrase and we repeat that that proverb without realizing the origin of it was actually quite racist.
Right.
And I think that goes to my point that even if you accept that lesson as true, how do you feed the right part of you? By learning and understanding and inquiring about what is actually the origin of the stories that we tell. What is the origin of the feelings that I have? Why do I, and take an innocuous example. I quite enjoyed the Lord of the Rings Amazon series. And when, people say, oh, it was terrible and it was too woke and it was awful. And I feel this little part of me that goes, oh, that pisses me off why I would say that. Why is that? And ultimately it's because people are putting a judgment on what you think is good. And as human beings, we want to be right. We want to have good judgment. We want the things that we like to be right. And that's a really simple example, but you can apply that to religion. If you've grown up your entire life believing in one thing, and then somebody comes along and says, no, that's wrong, that's evil, they're not just saying that you're wrong, but your life is, your identity, your family is wrong. And those are the things that we love and we're precious to. And so I think the best thing that we can do in order to understand and fight the hate within us is to learn. Understand why does it happen? Why are we feeling the way that we're feeling? And what is the origin of the things that I'm told, and make decisions based upon that. But the second thing is to learn to be patient and to not respond as quick as we are used to responding, particularly online. Take a moment and breathe, don't react.
And part of that breathing is also detaching somewhat from your beliefs. They're not necessarily you. They're what you've come to believe. And so you can take some of the heat out of it because, like you were saying, people feel personally attacked when someone disagrees with them. So almost separating yourselves from your belief a little bit, being a witness to them.
Yeah, and I think it was also a really good point about some practices that we used to have that were very common that we don't anymore, that I think were really beneficial. So, practices where we might say grace before having a meal, if you were Christian, or you would do a blessing to ancestors before a meal. Those sorts of things are essentially like a systemized practice of gratitude and being grateful for the things that you have. And I know that sounds, if you're the kind of person that isn't into gratitude, it sounds kind of wonky. Yeah. And I totally get it. As somebody who, I had an executive coach who was trying to get me to gratitude journal every night before bed, and I refused to do it because it sounded hard and stupid. And when I started doing it, I use a biometric tracker, and I actually found I slept way better and recovered about 10% better every time I gratitude journaled. So I was convinced. My point being is that I think we've got a couple of problems. One, we have an online world where we're face to face with things that we disagree with, that we find confronting, that we don't have the resources of how to handle without it resulting in an eruption and hate within us, because we're being told that our view is wrong. We're also then pressured to respond quickly. That's how social media networks are designed. But then outside of that, in the real world, we've lost a lot of practices that do help us to feel calm and secure and okay. Things like religious practices that essentially are gratitude, having community. A lot of the social ties that we used to have through religious communities, even just the way towns were designed, we don't tend to have that in the modern world anymore. And I think it's really easy to put this rise in hate at the doorstep of social media. I think that's a contributing factor, but it's not the only problem.
That's wonderful. Just focusing on these bigger themes like religion and perspective or philosophy. One other thing I'd like to add is beauty. Just seeing something beautiful, a rose, or looking up at the night sky. I only look at the night sky once every 4 months. And then I feel, oh, that's there. How calming is this big transcendental thing? So maybe incorporating a bit of beauty as well.
I love that. I love that very much. And I think you've hit the nail on the head So in 2018, I think it was, there were these riots in France. They're called the Yellow Jacket riots. And I'm not sure if you remember it, but it was sort of shut down a lot of Paris and a lot of France networks. Basically, the government had removed a tax credit for diesel. So it brought the cost of diesel up in line with the cost of petrol. So that sucks if you use diesel a lot, but it is what it is. And the result were a rise in online discourse around this is really unfair. It's gone too far. This government is corrupt. This isn't the France that I knew. And a movement was formed by those that wanted to protest against that tax credit being removed. Tax credit is, I'm sure, not what we came on here to talk about, but bear with me. Fast forward months, and Macron had to negotiate with the protesters, and they set up grievance books in cities across France. And these grievance books were to say, come in and tell us what you're angry about, and we'll listen to you and try and fix it. The top grievances that were listed were, hey, put the tax credit back in place, which, okay, makes sense. It was also an abolition of gay marriage, a restriction on immigration into the country, and an investigation into corruption of the government, which made me really curious to why is that? Why were those the touch points for an organization, a movement that started because of diesel? And the origination of that movement were typically, and this is not universally, but it was just the core, were originally agricultural-based workers, traditionally, culturally very French, middle class and Christian. And you can understand from their viewpoint that they've grown up as multi-generational French in a country that is increasingly not French, or is new French people who look different to them. Their way of life and a religion of Christianity is now, from their perspective, under assault from things like gay marriage. And they're also living in a world that is very economically tough, and that wealth inequality that I mentioned, if your life is being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and the last straw is, as an agricultural worker, I use diesel a lot, and now it's going to cost me more, you've lost, from their perception, I would imagine, a lot of status, and you don't feel important anymore. And so bit by bit, that social dominance of I'm, a French farmer in France and I'm being moved down as I perceive the chain of importance, then you get angry, and the result is rioting and protesting. And I think that is pretty much like the playbook for hate. We can say we want beauty and beauty will help, but how can you... It's difficult to find beauty if you live in cities and you're working your ass off to make ends meet. And every year with inflation, the cost of groceries, it gets harder and harder. And it feels like everybody else is winning and you're not. And as a result, you want to look for who can I blame and who can I be pissed off at. And in many times, there are people who actually can be, and probably for a different podcast about why wealth inequality exists. But that hatred has to go somewhere. I'm
going to withdraw my suggestion of beauty. That's not enough. But
well, no, I think it is. It is like it definitely helps, but it's how do you give that to people who don't have time?
That's right, and maybe there's something even more significant than that, and that is the connection between hate and stress. Because when people are stressed, even personally, they're more irritable, and as a community, when they're stressed and impoverished, they're less tolerant. I'm sure there's biopolitical research on the link between violent protests and high levels of stress in a community.
Well, I mean, like, what is stress? And if you talk to Dr. Pri from our team, she'll tell you, like, stress is a rise in cortisol levels. It's your body going into a response to a perceived threat, whether that is you've got a report due on Friday and it's Thursday afternoon and you haven't done it, or it's I don't know how I'm going to put food on the table for my kids tomorrow. Those are both sources of stress, and we are not animals that evolved for stress to be those things. We evolved for stress to be, this snake is going to bite me, or this new person down the road from this other tribe is going to kill me. We're looking for physical threats and to identify where that threat is coming from. And so you put then a modern person in a situation of, I don't know how I'm going to afford to pay for food for my family or pay rent, or, I can't find work. And I've been in all those situations myself. And I remember feeling like I'm trying the best that I can and I can't seem to figure out how to survive. I remember feeling angry and irritable and looking for an outlet of just like, why is this happening to me? And I think, you can look at the research that stress has greatly increased in society. That is also a contributing factor, but it's part of that whole system of we have almost... I think sometimes we've almost designed modern society to be the worst possible condition for our mental health.
Yeah, it's maximizing productivity.
Yeah.
But not necessarily minimizing stress.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we've covered hate and wokeness a little bit. What about what people do about it, which is cancelling those that they see as having offended moral standards? Can you tell us a bit more about cancel culture and what we might be getting wrong there?
Is this a setup to get me cancelled?
What is it? We'll talk about that, how treacherous the subject is in general.
Look, cancel culture, as a tool, my take on it is that it was a social technology developed to handle an injustice where it seemed like nobody was doing anything about this person or this identity. And what can we do as a society to remove them? And I think there are, from what I've seen, like some cases of that resulting in a good outcome, like particular power plays in Hollywood. But then I would also say in most cases that I've seen, the people who are cancelled, like they're fine and they come back. Like Louis C.K. was cancelled. I think he's doing really well now, and he's performing a lot. And like, did that achieve much? And I I kind of put cancel culture down as as hatred channeled into a very specific outcome, which is we want to excommunicate you from popular culture and society and whatever you might be doing. And I think there are cases where I completely am understanding of that, and there's probably some people these days that I would not be unhappy for them to be cancelled. However, I don't know if it's the solution. If what we do is go around and just cancel those that we don't agree with, I don't think that results in a productive society. And it's not to say that you have to agree with everybody, but if cancel culture is the only tool that we can develop to say the things that you're doing are wrong, and we don't think that you should be allowed to do that in a public setting anymore, I don't think it's working. Maybe cancel culture 2.0 might do it if we can figure that out.
Is there any a model of what 2.0 looks like?
I don't know.
Is it like a sin bin? It's like a temporary timeout.
I don't know. Like I think this is a random example, but Rick and Morty, like hugely popular cultural phenomenon, and the two main creatives publicly behind that was Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. And Dan Harmon was actually almost cancelled, I think. He was called out on some behaviour that he had with a female co-worker, and he, in response, we went on a podcast and he acknowledged his behaviour, and he from all perceptions, seemed to deeply apologise and clearly understand what he was being told and would make steps to change that. Justin Roiland, on the other hand, was cancelled as a result of his behaviour, which was pretty reprehensible from all accounts, and has been removed from that show. And I think, I guess my point is, if cancel culture's outcome is that somebody is just deleted, that is less of a good outcome than somebody being educated. And if you can educate somebody and they become then a champion and an agent of change in that subject, to me, that's the better outcome.
Let's then learn a bit more about this education that you think is really important. We've mentioned a couple of words in this session: gratitude, excommunicate, almost religious language. When you try to understand this subject, do you have to understand the religious impulse within us a little bit to understand why we behave the way we do? Have you looked into the history of the church when you're also looking at the history of social justice, for instance?
I grew up, my parents had me, actually my wife just found this out the other day, that I was baptized and had communion as a kid, which she was shocked by. She grew up in a very secular Asian household. I grew up in a very white pseudo-religious household, only because they wanted to fit in. My parents told me that they moved and the community was religious, and so it felt like, well, that's what we should do. And I can get that. Like, I can understand why, as a shortcut to a community, you buy into a religion and do the things to be part of that. I grew up in a Catholic school, had that whole experience, and understood religion as a code of conduct that theoretically would be good. But, I don't need to point to all the examples of how religion is bad. Like, I think we all know it can be bad.
But that's another thing, you can study how it's bad,
yes,
so that you can avoid some of those mistakes, or might suggest ways that you can handle it.
Well, okay. I'm personally not religious, spiritual, but not religious. And I respect anybody's right to be religious. And I also understand why. I can understand why you would want religion, whether it's for community or it's for your own personal beliefs. I don't personally think that human beings are naturally religious, just like I don't think human beings are naturally racist. But I do think that there is something in us, the way that we are programmed and wired, that we need, or we seek for something greater than us that gives us comfort and gives us guidance on how we should act as a society with each other. Because that shit is hard.
Yeah.
The more and more large communities grow, having something like a religion where it says, hey, these are our codes of conduct and we all buy into it, right? Cool. Is really useful. If we look ahead, into the next few decades, I don't see religion having a resurgence, but I do see there being something that for those that have hey, religion is not for me. I think you need something else, and whether that is purpose or community. If you don't have that, I think that you are. It's a lot easier to be affected by these things like stress, and it's easier to find things like beauty if you do have those things like community and purpose.
I like one phrase ahead. Why can't we just find interesting things to do with our days until we die? Just little small moments of joy, rather than a grand purpose and a grand meaning.
Yeah.
Some people do need that grand purpose and meaning, but others maybe can find joy in just the minutiae. Maybe that's possible.
Do you meditate?
I try to, but then I find it a bit boring as well.
Yeah.
That's my.
I just heard a really great quote just this week. I was listening to a video essay about reading, and the president of Brown University, her take on reading books was everybody should read books, and if you don't read books, you are having a lesser human experience. And her reasoning was books are forced meditation. If you find meditation boring, reading a book forces you to stop and reflect and to slow and to focus on just one thing. And I think that is, for me, very true. Like I struggle with meditation, but I love reading, and it's sort of that chance to stop. And I think it's no surprise that books have existed since they've been invented. Like we like that sort of thing. And, if I were to come up with like a cheat sheet for how we create a less hateful society, it would be greater sense of community, greater sense of purpose, greater sense of reflection and stillness, and more opportunity to understand each other's points of view. And those are like really big tickets, but you break them down into like, do you garden, or like what's your hobby for like
I live in an apartment.
Ashwin time?
You guys gave me a bamboo plant, olive tree once.
Is it alive?
I had to pass it to my parents because I thought I was going to kill it. But I enjoy the botanic gardens. That's my nature. I take my shoes off, let my feet touch the earth once a day. So I see the value of it.
Yeah, like tree bathing, I think is what it's called, right? Yeah. And scientifically, it's been shown like that calms us down. And I guess that goes to my point of like, if you, conversely to my like, how do you, the other thing to add to that list is financial security. You definitely need that. If you don't have that, you're looking, you're stressed. But if you were to create the worst, if you were to take like a town, wrap it in a bubble, and then I want to make these people here like the most stressed, angry, and hateful people, like what would you do? You would put them as far away conveniently from nature as possible. You would make them financially insecure and have to work long hours, which would then erode their physical health and well-being, which would also then raise their cortisol levels. You would have a lot of artificial light, which make them sleep less well. And you'd remove any sense of community. So how would you do that? You'd probably put them in small apartments where it's not typical to talk to each other in the hallway or the elevator.
Yeah.
You would also inundate them with a lot of social interaction constantly, a lot of messages and phone calls and emails all the time. So you're a bit exhausted of talking to each other, so that by the time you get home, all you want to do is sit in front of a glowing screen in your living room, order food off an app, take the food from the guy without looking at him, and then sit in silence. And I think if that that for me would depress the crap out of me, and that's an experience I've had. Yeah.
I live in a small apartment, and I painted the wall red, which is ridiculous
in
hindsight. Yeah, it's just piling on to that kind of stress levels. coming back then to what the Museum of Sticks and Stones is going to do about this issue. Obviously, you can't redesign the apartments of Brisbane. You can't build parks everywhere. You can't put Mozart in all the public toilets. What are you going to do? What's your focus in the year or two ahead?
Going to the toilet while listening to Mozart would be quite a beautiful experience.
Yeah, he was quite pleasant. Well, wasn't it Bach? Or no, Beethoven was very dramatic and evil sounding.
It's like what's that? Like the Ride of the Valkyries or something. Like while you're what do we do? I think it starts with knowledge. So when we started as a nonprofit back in 2011, our focus was on suicide prevention, and particularly for young men. And a lot of that came from me, my experiences of being 12 and suicidal and almost taking my own life. And at that time, like I didn't talk about it to people. It wasn't something that you just couldn't talk about it. It was very taboo. And accessing help then was really hard, because if you can't talk about your vulnerabilities as a man, how do you then seek help and say, look, I'm having a tough time? And so that became our focus, is on shifting the cultural narrative around being a man means that you're constantly tough, to soften up every now and then, seek some help, it's okay. And I think we made a dent in that. And the decade since has drastically changed in how society talks about mental health. We had a news anchor interviewing us live on Prime Network television who, this is 2011, 2012, revealed that he had been suicidal, which like was unheard of at the time. And so I think, no, we can't build parks or apartments. Maybe one day. There actually is a group in Melbourne doing really great work around that, to fight both wealth inequality and lack of community and lack of green space, called Breathe. And they build these apartments that are actually hit all those three things at once. As for us, though, I think it starts with laying the groundwork about information and starting to change the cultural perception around, we don't talk about hate. Hate doesn't happen here. It happens over there in that country. We don't have riots against particular racial groups in this country. We don't have a history of these things happening, or just that, day to day you will feel hate. And that's not something to be ashamed about, I don't think. It is something to think about and to understand, and then to make choices based on that, better informed. That's the kernel of our work, is that if we can help, and I think about, I'm about to have a kid in February. And if my son can grow up in a world where he is taught, you are going to feel hate throughout your life. And it's not on you to squash that. It's on you to listen to that and understand it. And then to feed the other part of yourself that's more patient, more understanding, to look after yourself so you feel these things less strongly. And I think this is probably a little saccharine, but I've long felt that if you want to feel less of something, if you want to feel less angry, less hateful, less sad, the best way to do that, the fastest way to do that, is to help somebody else feel less angry, hateful, or sad. And remarkably, once you do that, it just solves yours. And so if we can equip people to understand themselves, but also to reach out to others and to have these conversations, yeah, I think that'll make a difference.
Gratitude, acknowledging community, creating better environment and safe space, more healthy spaces for us to live in. This idea you've talked about a couple of times, how hate is in all of us. I was thinking back to psychology. In the early years of the 20th century, Freud and Jung especially, talked about our shadow side. We've got to get to know our shadow, whereas he got replaced, I think, by the CBT people, the cognitive behavior therapy people, who said, forget all that mythological nonsense. And so maybe in the last 50 years, we've become very good at the transactional psychology of CBT, but we've forgotten that we do have a shadow, and it's a good idea to get to know it.
Yeah, that's a really smart statement, so I'm not sure I'm equipped to comment on that, but I acknowledge how clever that statement is.
Or just the darkness within us. But I just think as a culture, we've gotten away from the darkness. We've become a big happy musical, singing and dancing. Everything's great. Yeah. We hide dead bodies away. When it comes to funerals, we just hide darkness and death in our culture, I think. And We're less honest, perhaps, because of doing that.
Yeah, honesty. Like I think that's the key thing of. I was sitting with my dad once at dinner, and he's an interesting guy, and he's very smart, but we don't often have a lot of deep conversations. I guess we do, but more and more so as we both get older. And he said to me once, he acknowledged that as he was growing up, and I think he'd bought a house, his first house. So as a boomer, it would have been like $5, I assume. That his neighbours were First Nations Australians. And he was talking to them one day and found out they were renting. And he's like, oh, have you thought about buying? And they said to him, well, yeah, but nobody will give us a home loan. And he's like, well, why not? And we're like, because we are who we are. And he had never realised until that moment, he told me, that sort of perception existed and that existence was different to him. And I found that super impressive for my dad, who's in his later stages of life, and to have that self-awareness and to tell me this was a moment where he had learnt something new. And I think honesty is important to acknowledge we don't know everything, to understand that, yes, that we are all learning and we're not going to get this perfect, that you're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. It doesn't make you wrong or bad or broken. You're just learning. At the same time, you will still say or do things that are not kind. And, one of my personal values, my number one personal value was kindness. But I let myself down on that all the time. And the goal is to not be perfect. The goal is to understand that you are naturally imperfect, and as is everybody else. And if you can be honest with yourself about that, I think that we'd have a lot more patience, and as a result, probably be nicer to each other.
We've covered a good mix of themes here today. Will, thanks for your time.
I hope it was helpful and made sense, and I will go get the Mozart ready for the bathrooms.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Parley podcast. To register for future events, you can find the link in our show notes. You'll also be able to explore our research and hear people's stories about experiencing harm online. You can find us across all socials at sticksstones.org. The Parley Unplugged is proudly brought to you by Darla Health, your personal wellbeing partner. Darla is an Australian-born AI-powered wellbeing app designed to help you understand yourself, your emotions, and provide personalised feedback and tools to improve individual mental wellbeing. Head to hellodarla.com to learn more.